My name is Mike McKenzie. I grew up in Lodi, California, known as the infidelity capital of the world. When I got married, we moved down to Southern California. I worked as a salesman for a tile company, and I did really well. I was one of the top salespeople in the company, so they gave me a store of my own in Anaheim. That's what I did until my wife got pregnant. Then we decided to move back to Central California to raise our family there. We ended up raising 4 kids, all very athletic. They all played sports. Over a coaching career of about 19 years, I coached more than 30 different teams, from t-ball to high school. My oldest son, Ben, was studying in Santa Barbara. He graduated, got his license to be a nuclear medicine technologist, met someone at church, and they decided to get married. It was the last weekend of summer before the younger kids went back to school. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday. We thought about going there on Wednesday because, we wanted to have a little mini vacation to say goodbye to summer before the kids went back to class. So we arrived on Wednesday afternoon. And of course, my 2 younger kids brought balls and bats with them. They saw a big park right next to the hotel. So the kids said to me, "Hey Dad, let's have a home run derby. Why don't you come with us after we check in?" I said, "Yeah, sure, sounds good." And we played baseball, hung out, and played for probably a couple of hours. That night, I started feeling unwell, like I was coming down with the flu. And I thought, wow, great timing to get the flu right before my son's wedding. I didn't think much of it because it wasn't that bad. But on Thursday, I kept thinking, this isn't good. Friday came, and by then I had a bit of a fever and was starting to sweat. We managed to get through the rehearsal dinner, and I was joking around with some of the guests on. I said, I'm coming down with the flu, but this wedding is costing me a lot of money, so I'm going to take a bit of every dessert. I'm going to take your goodies and make sure I get my money's worth. We left and went back to the hotel. My son and I were sitting at the bar. He works in healthcare, so he was trying to figure out what was going on with me. He asked, "Did they remove your appendix?" I replied, "Well, I don't think it's my appendix because they always say there's a specific tender spot, like when your appendix is inflamed. There's a spot on your abdomen that you press, and it hurts a lot." That didn't happen to me, but I just thought it doesn't add up. At 1 a.m. I decided to go to Quick Stop to buy some Tylenol to reduce my fever. I came back, took it, but it didn't help much. The Tylenol eased the pain a little, but I still had a pretty high fever, Now I was sweating a lot. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. Before my son's wedding, I was starting to look pretty pale. We went through the entire wedding, and then some guests began to leave. I said, "Guys, I need to go, even if they want to check me out. Something is seriously wrong." So we drove to the hospital. I finally saw the nurse in the ER, and she took my temperature. It was 104.3. I felt awful. Miserable, actually. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours. She pressed on my abdomen and asked, "Does this hurt?" I said, "No, it doesn't hurt." Then she pulled out a small hammer like the kind they use to check reflexes, tapped the sole of my foot, and asked, "Does that hurt?" I laughed a little and said, "No." She tapped the other foot, and suddenly the pain in my abdomen made me scream. She said, "All right, that's your appendix. I'm calling a surgeon." Then she asked, "Have you done any physical activity recently?" I replied, "Oh, I played baseball with the kids on Wednesday afternoon," and her expression changed. She said, "Wednesday, and this is Saturday night." And she was thinking Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that's 3 days. If your appendix ruptured while you were playing baseball, 3 days later, you're in trouble. About half an hour later, the surgeon arrived. He says, "Your white blood cell count is really high, so I think your appendix probably burst." Then he adds, "If it did burst on Wednesday, we need to get in there faster." They prepare me for surgery, start the IV, and take me down the hallway. I say goodbye to my wife. They swing open the doors to the operating room, and I thought, man, it's freezing in here, but I still have a fever of 104. I was sweating, but I thought, God, it's so cold. How do they work in these conditions? They slide me onto the operating table, and I thought, this thing is tiny. I'm going to fall off. I felt like I had nowhere to put my hands. I looked to my right, and out of nowhere, Jesus is standing there. The physical person and everything else just vanished. There were no other people in the room, and I look around, really confused. I'm thinking, what's going on here? Then I thought to myself, I died. And I thought, I've heard about people who, when they die, see themselves floating above their bodies. But I didn't do that, so I must not be dead. So what is going on? It wasn't like a dream. It was more like an intensified reality. It all began the moment Jesus appeared. Everything was different. His skin was much darker than I remembered from childhood. He almost looked like an Arab man. He wore a white robe. He had wavy brown hair and these dark blue-green eyes. And when those eyes looked into mine, he looked right into my soul. I could feel the love radiating from him. That's what convinced me he was Jesus. Everything about him just radiated love. He reached out his hand and said, I want to answer your prayer. And I was thinking, my prayer? What the heck? I didn't make the connection right away, but then I remembered. I used to pray as a child for Jesus to show me heaven. I remember when my grandfather passed away. He was Catholic. We went to his funeral, and there was a priest there holding a ball on a chain. It had holes, and smoke was coming out of it. The smoke was rising, and the priest said, the smoke represents our prayers rising up to heaven. They were talking about how Grandpa is in heaven now. There's no more pain, no sadness, no tears. I remember as a child thinking, wow, that sounds like a wonderful place. I'd like to see it. I reached out my hand and took his. The moment I took his hand, we were standing on a hill. Everything around me was white, like the brightest, purest white I've ever seen. It was almost blinding. I looked down at my feet and realized I was barefoot. I was still wearing a gown, the surgical gown. And then I saw this beautiful green grass. It looked perfectly trimmed. It was flawless. The color was aquamarine, the most beautiful grass I've ever seen. My senses felt so heightened that I could count every blade of grass touching my feet. I could feel each one. I knew exactly how many blades were there. It was wild. I looked around, trying to adjust my eyes to the brightness so I could see better. To my right, there was an even brighter white light. I looked at it and thought, wow, that's really amazing. Suddenly, from that light, rays began shooting out. They looked like fluorescent tubes, like the kind you use in a workshop, 4-foot tubes, but these were about 2 feet long. They were thick, soft, and glowing with light. Then they started zooming past me. Everything around me was white, but these tubes glowed white as if they were flashing. It felt strange. As I watched, I was amazed, but also confused. Obviously, very confused. I spent a lot of time wondering, what is this? Where am I? I was watching these things when one suddenly came straight for my head. I thought, what am I supposed to do? Should I dodge it? But it hit me right on the forehead, and as it did, a buzzing sound began, a light buzz that passed through me. It warmed me from head to toe. The cold I felt in the operating room disappeared and was replaced by this beautiful warmth. Suddenly, it was like someone pulled back a curtain on my right or left side, and the white, whatever it was, a mist, a veil, or just the whiteness, pulled away. It moved to the side, and now I could see a stunning landscape. I realized I was standing on a hill. Below me, there were little flowers that looked like sweet peas, They had tiny soft petals all in pastel shades, purple, yellow, orange, and pink, and they were simply beautiful. They seemed to move as if dancing in the wind, but there was no wind. So I'm thinking, why are they moving? Then, at the base of this hill, the white shape that had been separated from me is now resting in the valley, and there's a huge city down there. But I can only see the rooftops, as if the city is shrouded in a light fog. I can't see the entire city, just the rooftops. And there's this big golden dome, like the dome on a Capitol building. There are smaller golden domes too. The city is massive. It seems miles away, and there are some other white structures rising up, almost like church steeples, spiraling upwards. Beyond that city across the valley, there's another mountain, quite large, covered in pine trees. They look perfectly shaped and a beautiful shade of green. Above the trees is the most stunning sunset I've ever seen. Just above the treetops, the sky was ablaze with reds, oranges, and yellows, then fading into purples, greens, and blues, a bright blue at the very top. Meanwhile, these beams of light are still bouncing around, passing through me, now crossing the valley. One of them strikes the tip of a tree. It's like I held a diamond, because when the light touched the tip, it exploded into hundreds of tiny sparkles. Before long, the entire mountain was lit up with these rays of white light bursting and moving everywhere. It was like a massive fireworks show, but all in bright, fluorescent white, and I'm just watching, thinking. I couldn't die. I collapsed to my knees, and the moment they touched the ground, a jolt hit me and brought me back. So now instead of this blurry scene, I have a doctor leaning over me, wearing a mask, and he asks, "Do you know your name?" I opened my mouth to speak, but it was so dry, yet I managed to say the word, "Mike." And he says, "Oh, good." Then he asks, "Do you know where you are?" And now I'm confused again because I'm thinking, well, do you know where Jesus is? Where is heaven? What's the setting, you know? And he asks once more. Then he tells someone in the room something. And that's when I realize there are about 5 other people in the room, all wearing surgical gowns. He says, "Hey, it's fine. He's going to be okay." Something like that. Something like that. And I'm all alone. Then he says, "Let's take him to the ICU." And I look over. I glanced to the side and saw the crash cart. I noticed one of the paddles was off to the side, and the wires were hanging. It was clear they had just used it. Someone was already putting the equipment back together, and I thought, oh boy, you know. If I died, the surgeon came to see me the next day while checking my stitches. "You know, feeling around and checking my temperature," he said to me. "That's the worst case I've ever seen." I said, "You're kidding." He started to leave the room, but then came back. And he said, "I've seen worse, but they didn't make it." Then he said, "Yours was the worst case I've seen where the patient survived." My wife came to see me a couple hours after that. She asked, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Well, not so great, you know." But I said, "You're not going to believe what happened." She goes, "Really? What?" I opened my mouth to tell her and just started crying. I thought, I'm not even going to try to explain all this about Jesus yet. So the next day she came in and said, "Hey, so what happened?" I opened my mouth to tell her. I cried again, and it took me 3 days before I could finally tell her the whole story. And you know it still makes me cry now. It was truly something very emotional. When I told her, of course, she started crying too. And I thought, you know, this really is something incredible that happened to me. It's an emotional story for me, because I think it really marked the beginning of a relationship with Jesus. I would describe myself kind of as a Sunday Christian, you know. I went to church on Sundays, but I just didn't really understand it. After that incident, I knew it was real, a real physical person. I mean, that changed everything I thought I knew about heaven. And I thought, well, maybe it really is a physical place. How could God just hide it from us right now? I mean, God can do anything. I was on a liquid diet for probably 6 days. I still had a fever, and they wouldn't let me leave until my temperature went back to normal. Then at some point the doctor said, "Okay, let's start you on semi-solid food. Let's see how you do." One of the first things they gave me to eat was a banana. I thought, all right, finally something other than beef broth. Since I'd spent 12 days in the hospital, I had lost 34 pounds. I was as skinny as a rail. So I was really happy to have that banana. As I started peeling it, the wonder of God's creation hit me like a ton of bricks. I began to cry uncontrollably, thinking, I'm eating something that grew from the ground thousands of miles away, and BMAD is helping me get healthy again. It was like the weight of creation struck me. Walking is important in the hospital after surgery. They want you up on your feet. I remember the nurse coming in and saying, You need to get up and walk. Today's the day. Help me get you out of bed. I had 4 different IV lines, you know? There were tubes coming out of me in places I didn't even know they could put them. It was crazy. So I got out of bed, grabbed my little IV stand, and started walking down the hall. The nurse was helping me. I passed by some pictures of a beach village, pictures of the ocean, sunsets, and I remember thinking, what have I been missing? I'm so stressed out. And those images changed everything. They changed how I look at life. Here's how I describe my life before the ACM. I'd get up early in the morning, head to a very stressful job. I was a superintendent for a real estate development company, overseeing between 30 and 35 houses at various stages of construction. I'd come home, toss the baseball gear or whatever into the back of the truck, and rush off to catch a baseball game or practice. And at some point, while trying to figure out where we'd get dinner because we finished at 6:30 and the kids had homework, you know, I had to help them, and it was just the same old routine. Rinse and repeat every day. Stress. One of the biggest changes for me after that experience was that I started to apply what I had noticed in the hallways. Walking back and forth, looking at those pictures, I thought, I'm just going to slow down. I'm going to stop and enjoy every moment of my life. Whether I'm walking in a park or somewhere else, if I see a flower, I'll bend down and smell it. I don't care if anyone sees me or thinks it's weird. My phone is full of pictures of sunsets and flowers. It feels like I'm seeing the world through the eyes of a child. Jesus didn't give me a specific assignment, but I think that's what he wants me to do. To tell everyone, you know. Slow down, man. Just appreciate the beauty of his creation. I believe that's why we were created. To spread God's love. I'm nothing special. I'm not loved any more by God than anyone else. I always tell people, now ask God to reveal himself to you, and he will, but be patient, because that prayer took 40 years to be answered. But what are 40 years to God? I definitely don't fear death. Now I always think, when I die for the last time, and don't come back, Jesus will meet me on that hill and say, let's see what you couldn't see that day. Let's spend some time in the city. I'll show you the place. But I always say, just not today. Not yet, because there's still so much life left to live, you know? I mean, now I have 13 grandchildren. If I had died back then, I wouldn't have met any of them. But I think that's probably why he let me live.